will be spilling all sorts of tea about what's going on inside Washington, D.C., what regulators and lawmakers are thinking and working on, and what you and your credit union should be focused on in terms of risk areas and areas of opportunity. I'm your host, Ann Petros, also Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at NAFCU, and today I am joined by Carrie Hunt.
Hello, Ann.
Carrie is President and CEO of the Virginia Credit Union League, and as many of you likely know, formerly the head of government affairs at NAFCU and an expert on advocacy both at the federal and state level. And so we've got a lot to talk about. Thank you so much for joining me, Carrie.
We do, Ann, and thank you for having me. It is so exciting to be back, although I have to say, since I left, these reading glasses are new, which doesn't excite me quite as much as some other changes, but that's okay.
Well, they look great on you, so good choice. All right, well, let's dive in. What do you see as the biggest difference between advocating on the state level versus federal level, which you were used to doing for many years here at NAFCU?
There are definitely a lot of differences, and I'll go through a few of those. But if I had to pick one, the biggest one is speed. Yeah. There are a few legislatures that are in session all year round, but the rest tend to have short sessions. In Virginia, we have one session that's 45 days. The next year, it's 60. So that's a really short period of time to actually pass or stop legislation. Now, work goes on throughout the year in terms of preparing for things and drafting bills, building coalitions, but that actual legislative period is really, really tight. So you have to be, really, really, really quick with making sure you're on top of everything. So I would say that's pretty common in most legislatures that we tend to have part-time legislatures in our country. So I would say speed. But, when you look at state advocacy, it really covers a really broad swath because, of course, politics start at the local level, whether it's the school board, going way, way, down into the weeds up to, of course, the governors of states. And what is so impactful about state advocacy is you really are making those connections, those personal connections with policymakers, and you are so close to demonstrating, what, for instance, and of course, for us credit unions do, and as it impacts communities, those examples, seeing those things firsthand, really are quite impactful. And so you that's a benefit, but also you have to be cognizant that things are taken more personally too, because because they are. So I could I'm sure as we talk a little more, we'll go through some of those differences, but it really is that local connection, having to be on top of everything, and also the knowledge that everything that happens at the state level ultimately trickles up to the federal level in one way or the other. So there's this push-pull that you have to be cognizant of.
Yeah. I can imagine that that local connection is a bit of a double-edged sword. So that makes sense.
It can be. I will say I very much enjoyed it. I love to see how we can be impactful in communities. But it is different. I'll give you one example. Last Friday, we were delivering a campaign contribution to Barbara Favola, and her campaign, quote unquote office is her house. She's a state senator here in Virginia. So, I went and delivered the check, and we had a nice conversation, but we're sitting at her dining room table in her house. So that's a big difference between going up and having a meeting with the dome in the distance and the marble halls, and you tend to have a bit more intimate conversations.
Yeah,
so, but it's
which
fun.
is a good thing.
It is a good thing. It is. I actually find too, when we meet with our congressional delegation, actually back in the district, they also, I think, tend to be a bit more relaxed, and you can have a different conversation. I think both are important, right? There's also something to be said for the gravitas of Capitol Hill. But you tend to be able to have a little bit more time to breathe and get deeper into some of the issues. Whereas, as you know, when you're in those office buildings, you're being rushed in and out because there are about 800 other meetings behind you.
Exactly. Yeah. You're not the only one waiting to have a conversation. Well,
Definitely.
yeah, I mean, it sounds like those, that opportunity to have a more personal and potentially more candid conversation is refreshing. So,
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
What are some of the key issues that are top of mind for state regulators and lawmakers?
There's a lot that's going on right now. And I think in part when you have a congressional environment where there's a lot of gridlock, and we've experienced that for, quite some time now, issues tend to percolate more on the state side because they can actually see the light of day. We've seen movement relative to state interchange bills. There's been a push to potentially exempt taxes, sales tax from interchange revenue. And we had that last session in Virginia. We had Delegate Reed, who was contemplating introducing that, and we were able to have a conversation to try to prevent that. But that same conversation is happening in other states. Florida just experienced that, and they were able to push back on that legislation. So I think that that's definitely one. Another one is earned wage access. And this is something that really has started to percolate in the past year or two. There are these earned wage access providers, which may or may not be consumer friendly. And there's a big policy debate as to whether or not these providers are really just a different type of payday lender. Are there fees that are pulling people into debt traps? And so that's a big issue as well. I will say ESG bills. That is popping up and flying through the country. And I think ESG is a really great example of really how I think state law issues work, because when I first started my role 2 years ago, ESG was really just starting to enter into our lexicon. And I had a conversation with one of my league president peers out in Utah, and it was already hot out there, but hadn't made its way to Virginia yet. Well, lo and behold, fast forward 18 months, I'm sitting there having a conversation with one of our state delegates in Virginia who was contemplating introducing anti-ESG legislation. And with ESG, if you look across the country, in states that are red, they typically introduce anti-ESG legislation. In our states that are blue, it tends to be pro-ESG legislation. And to date, most of the states that have actually passed ESG legislation, it's been anti-ESG. In Virginia, we would love the status quo. We don't necessarily want the legislator to jump in one way or the other. But it was fantastic that we have this connection with all of our credit unions and the whole league system across our country, because when issues start to percolate in other states, then it puts us on notice that we could see this proliferation, and then we're prepared to try to stop it. So that's definitely another one as well. And I'll say if I had to pick a last, number 4, I would say PACE lending bills have been popping up a lot. And
interesting. The CFPB just issued a rule on that.
So I think there's some more state law issues connected to PACE. So we'll see if some of those issues come up as well.
Interesting.
But I could name a bazillion other laws, right? There's do we need to change the UCC? Do we look at, there's just a whole host of things that we have to sort of track. And for us in Virginia last year, a lot of our time was spent on defense and making sure that some well-intentioned bills didn't impact credit unions. But so it's definitely, it's fast and furious and a lot of different balls in the air, but that's okay.
Yeah. One topic that came up recently was Community Reinvestment Act, and obviously that's on the state level. Have you been seeing a lot of movement there? I mean, there aren't a lot of states that require credit unions to engage in CRA.
There hasn't been tons of movement relative to standalone bills. There certainly have have been some introduced, but what we're starting to see is CRA being used as a poison pill attached to other pieces of legislation. And that is obviously problematic.
That's frustrating.
I don't want to call it our enemies, but those who are not our friends of the credit union movement, yes, are getting smarter as to how they go about these things, and
that is creative.
A lot of roadblocks are being put up all across the board. So we haven't yet to see one in Virginia, but never say never.
Yeah, well, several states, including Virginia, have data privacy laws on the books, and a lot of other states are considering similar bills. I mean, obviously, we've got California with a very robust data privacy framework, but not all of those laws or proposed bills do include financial institutions. Some have exemptions for, those that are already subject to the requirements of the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. So could you provide just a really brief rundown of those data privacy laws and legislation across the country? Now, I don't expect you to get to all of the states.
I'm putting my reading glasses on because I did.
Maybe the top states where we should be really concerned about. And, what do you think are the next steps on the federal level? Because I think that's really the big question for people.
All right. So these are the states that have privacy laws enacted. So of course, California, and Virginia, and I'll use those two. So California is the most consumer friendly. That was the first one, and everyone looked at that, and it certainly raised some concerns just in terms of the business side. Virginia passed a version several years ago, and Virginia's law was the first one that exempted Gramm-Leach institutions that comply with Gramm-Leach-Bliley from privacy laws. So that's what we have in Virginia. Now, most of the states that subsequently have implemented laws follow the Virginia model and have some level of Gramm-Leach-Bliley, but I will say these laws do differ from degree to degree. But Colorado, Connecticut, Indiana, Iowa, Montana, Tennessee, Utah, in addition to Virginia and California, have privacy laws in place. And these were bills that are still active: Delaware, Louisiana, Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island. And then we have bills that have been filed but are inactive. And I'll say Hawaii, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Maryland, Minnesota, Mississippi, Oklahoma, Vermont, Washington, West Virginia. And so as you can see...
Yeah, wow. Are there any states that aren't considering data privacy?
Very few. But, and we're laughing about it, but, this is why we need to have a federal standard in place.
Yes.
Now, relative to that, a new wrinkle has come up this past year in that the National Association of Insurance Commissioners has a group which is working on model privacy legislation. And recent drafts of that, or original drafts, were not in favor of having this Gramm-Leach-Bliley exemption. In particular, it also shifted from an opt-out to an opt-in. So in short, if this model that these insurance commissioners would like gets passed across the country, it could potentially be problematic. So I think the sooner we have a national model in place that, of course, for us includes exemptions for regulated financial institutions, then the better. It's the question is, can we get there fast enough? I will say the more states that pass a more business-friendly model like Virginia has, I think there's certainly a bigger push and more pressure on the federal side to enact something similar. But of course, as you know, it all depends on what our composition looks up at the federal level and who sits in those seats. The biggest nightmare, of course, would be to have a federal standard that doesn't preempt state standards, and you have various state standards all across the board, and
be entirely unhelpful.
That would be the absolute worst thing. So we certainly will try to avoid that. I'll go so far as to say at all costs we'll try to avoid that.
Yeah. And there have been some bills introduced that are floating out there, but just have not been able to make headway, really. I mean, obviously, especially recently, there have been other priorities on the federal level, but it seems like this is definitely an issue that's not going away anytime soon and needs to be addressed.
I'll mention too on the state side, legislative sessions, even though typically are shorter, they also don't all start at the same time. So as we speak, some legislatures are still working on issues. So it's always a rolling kind of look as to what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, turning to the litigation side of things, which I guess that also can play a role in the data privacy discussion. What trends are you monitoring at the state level, and do you think that any of these trends will work their way up through the federal court system?
Yeah. I would say the number one trend that we follow is litigation relative to employment and employer issues. And that may surprise some of the listeners, but for credit unions who are, of course, are corporations, even those who are federally chartered, have to comply with certain laws in the state that they're headquartered. So that is certainly top of mind for me in looking at how a lot of trends in employment law impact credit unions, because of course, every credit union has lots of employees and they have to manage the business side. We're seeing trends, of course, relative to employee issues with, strikes. We saw that just with TrueStage this past couple of weeks, and that's not litigation per se, but sometimes things, delve into that arena. We're seeing issues still coming out of COVID relative to disability. We are seeing potential issues relative to pay with, stay-at-home situations versus coming into the office, whether there's discrimination there. There are all sorts of those issues. So if I had to pick the top, it's actually all across the country, those types of issues. And looking at a few other things, we're actually seeing some litigation relative to ESG as well. So that's starting to percolate. We are also starting to see a lot of litigation relative to cybersecurity, whether states have different laws relative to notification for breaches or notices for various things. So we're seeing that on the state law side as well. And I think all of those issues have the potential to percolate up. So we definitely track things as well. I will say, too, at the state level, we, of course, want to make sure we have a great relationship with our attorney generals, who are the ones who also look to enforce consumer laws. And I think that's another really big area. We don't just have the CUPP, we have the states who have a huge focus on the consumer side as well. So we always want to make sure we're seeing what the attorney generals are doing versus not in terms of trends all across the country. So, yeah. We could talk for 3 hours, Anne, but we're not going to.
There's plenty to unpack there. I'm sure, all the cybersecurity issues, data breach class actions continue to come up. And I don't think that will change anytime soon. And it definitely is, an issue that relates to the federal level. NAFCU's been calling for, a national standard for data security that keeps merchants accountable as well. Do you see any prospect of something like that coming to fruition anytime soon?
At the federal level, or you mean in terms of impact at the states? And I guess both. I think define anytime soon, Anne, because I feel like I'm going to need 3 pairs of reading glasses before we get to that one. I will say that's actually a great segue to talk about fraud, because one of the biggest challenges that credit unions are facing right now is just the dramatic increase in fraud. And how do you combat fraud? What does that legal regime look like? What do best practices look like? How do you cover those costs? We haven't even really delved into the whole big attack on interchange at the federal level, is huge and top of mind. And for me, this is another area where I think the states have the potential to act, but I don't want to get in a situation like data privacy again, where we have all of this patchwork. So that's why it's so important to have this federal data security standard. And in Virginia, Senator Warner has been a huge advocate for cybersecurity and data security, but we haven't gotten to a point where we're passing legislation. So it's a huge priority, I think, for everyone, including at the state level, but a lot of work to be done still.
Right. Yeah. I'm not, I guess, too surprised to hear that. Are there any areas, now kind of shifting to the federal side of things, that, the NCUA should be looking at in terms of its regulations and modernizing those regulations to better align with some of the state regulations that impact credit unions?
I think that's a hard question to answer, because we really do have quite a difference in state charters all across our country. In Virginia, we only have 20 state charters left compared overall, and there are 105 credit unions in Virginia. So, of course, that means the rest are federally chartered. I will say there are still some things that I think are more flexible at the state level. And one of those, though, we're already attacking and addressing, and that's board modernization. In Virginia, state charter credit unions are allowed to have fewer than 12 board meetings a year. It's pretty flexible relative to just getting their bylaws approved, and we would love to, of course, see that happen at the federal level. As you know, we had a lot of traction in the last Congress, and hopefully we can get that across the finish line this time around. Also, I do think the NCUA has done a good job in recent years in trying to be more flexible. The biggest question is, does there still need to be flexibility on field of membership? And of course, NCUA just had an open rulemaking on that. And relative to one charter change, I believe Andrew Morris just testified specifically on that. So congratulations on pushing for that. So I think that's still a work in progress. At the state side, though, you typically have bankers who do a really great job at pushing back on individual credit union fields of membership. So it's a slog, it's a fight,
it's
down to the death in a lot of situations. So certainly, I think the stronger and more flexible regulatory standards we have and can point to, it's always helpful in regards to that. So. But, there's some state charters which are a lot more flexible than the NCUA on the field of membership. Others are not. So it really just depends.
Yeah.
It just depends.
Yeah. I mean, of course, we've got, a lot of states to think about, a lot of different regimes and rules that come into play, and they're not going to be consistent across the board.
I did forget one more, though, digital assets. So the NCUA has an opinion that credit unions can, custody and hold digital assets through third parties. Last year in Virginia, for state chartered credit unions, there's a separate now code section relative to that they can actually custody themselves under certain circumstances. So I think that's an example where I think potentially states may be a little bit more flexible in the federal level. But we'll see what the future holds relative to crypto.
Oh, yes.
I don't think some of the recent bank failures are helpful for that discussion.
No, definitely not. And there are lawsuits, and there's a lot of, I guess you could say, turmoil in that area. So a lot of unanswered questions, and more to come, I'm sure. But yeah, that is another area where, I don't think we're going to see a reversion. Digital assets are here to stay in one form or another. And so we just have to figure out how to incorporate them into our existing, financial, regulatory structure and work with them, because consumers will want them and need them and continue to use them. So we've got to have some sort of rules and structure and supervisory mechanism in place, whatever that may look like. Yes. I don't have all the answers.
Come on, Ann.
All right. So last question, kind of overarching, and we've talked about a lot of topics so far, but what would you say are the top federal regulatory and legislative priorities for your members? I know you mentioned interchange. I'm sure that's at the top of the list.
Interchange is definitely at the top of the list. Clearly, just yesterday, we had the reintroduction of interchange legislation at the federal level, which of course credit unions will continue to oppose. So I think that's going to certainly be top of mind and take up a lot of bandwidth over the next couple of months. And we'll see where we end up with that. It really is important to have grassroots relative to interchange because of the fact that these businesses are in individual congressional districts and they're the ones that are pushing for change. So I think this is a prime example as to how CUNA, NAFCU, the entire league system can be effective in working together and really trying to combat this. So it's going to be a lot of work in the next couple of months. And I know that there'll need to be a lot of resources put to this as well, whether it's ads, whether it's individual, specific campaigns. So a lot of work to be done there. But I know that the trades and credit unions are up to the task. So I would definitely say that is number one. The CFPB's continued looking at fees. I mean, it is trying to get through just some of the discussion and dialogue and kind of get to the core of the issue is always challenging. Credit unions being sucked into regulations for things they didn't do is very frustrating. So I think the credit unions have great stories to tell. I think credit unions have done a great job and continue to do a great job in trying to create products and services that their members need and want at an affordable cost. So I think we just need to continue to keep the drumbeat up so the CFPB truly understands the credit union difference. But that is, of course, hugely important to our members as well. And we already talked about data security and fraud prevention. And every day I hear a different instance of not a necessarily credit union struggle, but a story of a credit union member coming in after they've already been swindled and the credit union, being unable to help them. And that's just heartbreaking and it's a big challenge too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know the CFPB has some thoughts on that issue as well. And, lawmakers do, of course, in addition to the CFPB, but, I don't think there's an easy fix to that issue.
I did think it was positive that the CFPB flagged that there are lots of uninsured deposits, and
that was helpful
in some of these platforms, P2P platforms. So recognizing that insured financial institutions, including credit unions, are a better choice, I thought was an interesting approach. Yeah.
Yes. We'll leave it at that. Any other remarks or things that you want to share with our listeners and viewers?
I will just close on I think we have a fantastic federal and state system in our country. It plays off of each other, both the federal charter and the state charter, the federal legislature and regulators and the state legislature and regulators, and together with that sort of push-pull, we end up, I think, having great opportunities to make change for credit unions. And we also have great opportunities to learn from each other and achieve success. So I know that we ask a lot from our credit unions in terms of their participation, getting involved in advocacy, but in the seat I sit in now more than ever, I see how effective it can be. And I know that working together, we can achieve change. So that keeps me going every day. And, I think there's a lot of great things ahead for the credit union industry.
Excellent. Well, I'm feeling motivated too.
Awesome.
Yeah. Perfect. Yes, it is super important to stay engaged and coordinate with your leagues and trade associations and share your stories, because those are the stories that really are going to make the difference when we have conversations with regulators and lawmakers, and can actually move the needle.
Yes.
So, yeah, it's important. Well, thank you, Carrie, and thank you to our listeners and viewers for tuning in to this excellent discussion with Miss Carrie Hunt. If you enjoy watching or listening to the CUPP, please hit subscribe or the like button, turn on your notifications to get alerts about new episodes, and leave us a review. Let us know what you'd like to hear about in an upcoming episode. And we are always happy to have exciting conversations with guests like Carrie about all things credit union. So until next time.